Well, it's been a while since I talked about the last one, 7th and 8th commandments. But I want to finish the series, and so today we're going to study the 9th commandment. One of the places that we find it is in Exodus 20, verse 16, where it says, "Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor." We usually use the word lying, but here it has a little broader meaning, to not bear false witness against our neighbor. In the New Testament, it's expanded a little. In Ephesians 4, verse 29, it says, "Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers." This one is talking more on the side of what we're supposed to do. The other one is telling us what we're not supposed to do. But if we are not doing and saying good things about other people, and doing those things or saying those things that will help them toward the kingdom, then we are tearing them down. And so God has called us to a high standard in regard to the treatment of other people. And again in James 3:2, it tells us, "If any man offend not in word, the same is a perfect man." So I'm sure all of us have something that needs to change in the things that we say, especially about others. And when we really think about it, how much do we really know about each other? We might feel we know a lot, but the majority we don't know. And so how can we evaluate correctly? God is the only one that can evaluate correctly. And therefore, our job is to help each other, to build each other up, rather than to speak against each other. In the book Patriarchs and Prophets, it has a whole chapter on the 10 Commandments. It's worth reading every now and then, because several things came to me as I read it. Number one, I'm not a commandment keeper when you look at all the details. Second, we need Christ's commandment keeping to cover us and to take care of us. Otherwise, none of us could go to heaven. We have been breaking too many of the commandments. Maybe not in their, most obvious form, but when you look at them in detail, we become commandment breakers, or at least it's revealed that we do. Now, God doesn't want anybody to be discouraged when they discover that they've been breaking the commandments. But he says, don't worry, I have forgiveness and I have power to help you improve and to grow. And that is where we need to focus, not on how bad we are. We need to see it, but we don't need to focus on it. False speaking in any matter, every attempt or purpose to deceive our neighbor is here included. When I think of this, I think of some of the car deals I've had from Seventh-day Adventists. And in fact, for the most part, I don't like to buy a car from a Seventh-day Adventist, because they tell you, this has been a great car, there's nothing wrong with it, and you get it, And there is something wrong with it. Now, maybe they just weren't mechanical and they didn't know. I don't know. But you'll notice the way it's worded. If they didn't know, okay, they're not lying. But if they knew that something was wrong with that car and they didn't tell you about it, they have attempted or they've had a purpose to deceive their neighbor. And this is not keeping of that commandment. I heard of a car dealer. I never went there or witnessed it firsthand, but I heard of this car dealer that sold used cars. And the way he ran his business, on the side window of the car, he listed everything that was wrong with that car. And, you would think, well, he won't have many sales with doing that. But instead, his business grew tremendously because people knew that when they got a car there, what they paid for was what they got. And so he had a tremendous business by not deceiving his neighbor. But I'll tell you, most car dealers are not like that. You can be sure. An intention to deceive is what constitutes falsehood. So if we say something and we didn't realize it was false, that's not the problem. But the problem is when we know and we don't say the truth about it. Now, here's some very minor ways that we can tell lies. By a glance of the eye, we can tell a lie. A motion of the hand, an expression of the countenance. 3 ways that probably most people think it's okay to do that. Have you ever heard about the white lie, supposedly? There's no such thing as a white lie. Every lie is black. And doesn't matter how small of a lie it is, it's all condemned in this commandment. So those 3 ways a falsehood may be told as effectually as by words. I was very impressed with a story I read about God's smuggler. He was not a Seventh-day Adventist, but he was a Christian. And he went to a self-supporting school, but it wasn't an Adventist self-supporting school. And in that school, they trained their students to know how to exercise faith. And so, you know how in the days when communism was closed to Christianity, even some Seventh-day Adventists would do deceptive things to get Bibles and books into communist countries. They might build a little, cabinet or a container inside of their vehicle, but you couldn't see it unless you were really looking. And even then you might have trouble. That's the way they would smuggle them in. But this man, who became known as God's smuggler, he didn't do that. He would put the Bibles on the front seat or the back seat in a box, and he would drive up to the border, and the car in front of him, they were, looking in the trunk. They were looking in all kinds of places to try to find what wasn't supposed to go in. And he would drive up and he would pray this prayer: God, make seeing eyes blind. And then many times they would just wave him through. They wouldn't even look in his car at all. Or one time he was already inside of the communist country, and he was eating his lunch, and so some guards came by and they wanted to know what he was doing there. And he didn't tell a lie. He just said, you can look in my car. He had the Bibles right in plain view. And so they went, they searched his car, and they left, and his Bibles were still there. And he had those experiences throughout his whole life. And I thought, wow, he's an example to Seventh-day Adventists. Because we tend to feel we got to lie, and that it's okay to lie in those kind of situations. All intentional overstatement. Notice the word intentional. Somebody might, make their car sound wonderful because they don't really know cars very well. But an intentional overstatement, every hint or insinuation calculated to convey an erroneous or exaggerated impression, even the statement of facts in such a manner as to mislead, is falsehood. So a person can go away and say, well, everything I said was the truth. Yeah, but the way you arranged those facts told a lie. And so, God is looking at the impression that is made on the person we're talking to rather than what we said. This precept forbids every effort to injure our neighbor's reputation by misrepresentation or evil surmising, by slander or tale-bearing. Now, in the Adventist Church, I believe there are many times when slander is done and they get away with it. They don't get taken to court. And so we have been warned not to take our brother to court. And so it has a tendency to proliferate slander. But in the world, if you slander somebody's name, they can take you to court and they can really make some trouble for you. It's a serious offense to slander somebody's name. These others are ones that often go on within the church. I don't know of any particular, things going on here. But we do have to watch ourselves because, as I mentioned, we know so little about the situation. And so if we make a comment and there's other factors that we don't know, we hurt their reputation unnecessarily. And of course, we shouldn't do it anyway, even if it's true. We don't need to do that. But especially if it's not true, because there's some factors we didn't know. So this is very important, to watch any injury of our neighbor's reputation. If anything, we need to build up the reputation of our neighbors. And, husbands and wives, this is a very important thing for us too, because sometimes when we're with other people, we say things negative about our partner that does not build up their reputation. And that hurts a marriage over time. There's damage that is done. Or it might be said in a joke form, and that makes many people think it's okay to talk about your partner's faults in front of other people, but it isn't. And even though it's a joke, it hurts and brings pain and suffering. And so all of those things, we need to seek the Lord for help to get away from all of those things. And evil surmising, maybe there was nothing wrong, but somehow what we saw made us think it was wrong, and so we add a little bit in our mind to it, and we surmise that something bad has been done. I heard of this experience. I have told it before, but as a member was going home from church, they saw another church member going in the grocery store and coming out with a bag of groceries. So, of course, they surmised that they were breaking the Sabbath and that they were doing something they really shouldn't be doing. But when the rest of the story was found out, apparently, as that family was leaving church, somebody that was either homeless or in bad shape, didn't have food to eat, came to the church for help. And so they didn't have any money to give, and their home was too far away to go home and get the food. So they decided to go in the grocery store and buy some food for this person. Now, when you know the whole story, it changes your whole thinking about it. And that's why we should not evil surmise. Tale-bearing, of course, is just kind of like gossip. We just pass around, the news about each other to other people. Now, it's okay to pass around the good news. That's a blessing. But the bad news, we don't need to pass it around. In Mount of Blessing, page 68, it talks about this. These words, let your communication be yea, yea, which means let your yes be yes, nay, nay, which means let your no be no. Condemn all those meaningless phrases and expletives that border on profanity. Now notice how the commandments interweave, because we studied about not swearing. But here again, under this 9th commandment, we also address that issue. Then what about those things that we didn't really mean, but we said it because it would impress somebody in some way, but so we went ahead and said it, but we didn't really mean it? That's lying. I've sure had a lot of people. I'll tell you about one that probably nobody will figure out. But this person had come to Wildwood as a new worker. And they came up to me and they just buttered me up and told me how wonderful I was and everything. And, I've learned to beware of that. But it wasn't very long, maybe 2 or 3 months, and they were criticizing my sermons. And I thought, interesting. If we don't think that way, if that's not what we mean, we shouldn't say it. They condemn the deceptive compliments, the evasion of truth. Now, it's true, we don't have to tell everything we know, but we must not make statements that are misleading to confuse them so they don't understand the truth. The flattering phrases, the exaggerations, the misrepresentations in trade. So if we make people believe that what we're selling, whether we're in business for ourselves or whether we're just selling something personal, and we misrepresent it, then we are breaking this commandment. It says that are current in society and in the business world. Boy, do salesmen have to learn. I hope nobody here is a salesman. But if you are, you've probably been breaking this commandment, because it's so common for salesmen to really not tell you the whole truth. They'll tell you the positive side of things, the things that their product is really good at, but they don't tell you the rest. They don't give you the whole story. And so this is a misrepresentation in trade. They teach that no one who tries to appear what he is not, or whose words do not convey the real sentiment of his heart, can be called truthful. So if we present ourselves as different from what we know that ourselves are to be, now we don't have to tell people all our bad points just to be honest, but we must not present ourselves in a way that's not correct. And when we communicate with each other, and even with God, sometimes people get used to praying and using phrases that sound good to other people, but it's not really what's in their heart. We need to be presenting the real sentiments of our heart. Or if the sentiments are bad, just leave it out. We don't have to share that at all. If these words of Christ were heeded, they would check the utterance of evil surmising and unkind criticism. For in commenting upon the actions and motives of another, who can be certain of speaking the exact truth? You know, only God knows what the real truth is here. And so our duty is to put the best construction. I didn't put that quote in, but we are to put the best construction on what people do and what they say. Now, unfortunately, I've had some real struggles with this one, and I'm still struggling with it, but I think I'm doing better than I used to. That when I see things that are not the way they ought to be, to just leave it alone and not be talking in a way that can damage other people's view of that person. Now, what is the bottom line problem? How often pride, passion, personal resentment color the impression given? So we say something, but it is colored by what's inside of us. So then it ceases to be the truth. A glance, a word, even an intonation of the voice may be vital with falsehood. Even facts may be so stated as to convey a false impression. And whatsoever is more than truth is of the evil one. The biggest struggle the church has in general, speaking about any church denomination, the biggest struggle they have is this one. 2 Testimonies 4:66. Gossipers and news carriers are a terrible curse to neighborhoods and churches. 2/3 of all the church trials arise from this source. Isn't that amazing? I'm thankful to be in a church where I've had to deal with very little, and I'll soon be here 3 years, very little of this type of thing. And so I praise the Lord for that. But it is very common in churches to have gossiping and news carrying. And I suppose I got started a little bit young with seeing the danger of this, because I took a job in the Washington Adventist Hospital while I was going to school, and I worked in the food service department in the bakery. I worked almost every job, but in the bakery, the man that ran the bakery was a very good baker, but he loved to gossip. And people would come from all over the hospital to the bakery to catch up on the latest news of what was going on at the hospital. And I saw firsthand what a bad thing that was for him. Now, I should have labored with him probably, but I didn't. Testimonies to Ministers, page 504 and 5. Floating rumors are often the destroyers of unity among brethren. So here's one of the bad results. There are some who watch with open mind and ears to catch flying scandal. They gather up little incidents, which may be trifling in themselves, but which are repeated and exaggerated until a man is made an offender for a word. In other words, the whole case is built up on one word that got said. And it became a serious error that this person had done based on one word. Their motto seems to be report and we will report it. So just passing on stories that are negative, positive ones are good, but negative stories that are passed around. And have you ever played this game called Gossip, where you have a circle of people, and the one that starts it off makes a statement in the ear of the one next to them. And then the second one tells the next person what they thought they heard. And at the end, when you get to the end of the circle, the person says what they heard. And then the one that started it says what they said. That game alone should cure us of sharing stories, that are negative about each other, because sometimes it's laughable. Sometimes you wonder, where in the world could they get that from what the person said? But here is why. When you repeat, there is a tendency to put a little spin on it, News people talk about the spin put on the news. Well, we tend to do this with everything. We put a little spin on it, and then we pass it to the next one, and pretty soon it's very damaging, possibly, to the person that we might be reporting on. These talebearers are doing Satan's work with surprising fidelity, little knowing how offensive their course is to God. The door of the mind should be closed against, they say. Now here's something for the listeners. The listener has a responsibility. If in our heart we enjoy hearing bad things about each other, we will listen. But what we're supposed to do when somebody comes to us and says, they say, or I have heard, we are to close our ears to that. We're to make it plain that we don't want to hear that. Why should we not, instead of allowing jealousy or evil surmising to come into our hearts, go to our brethren, and after frankly but kindly setting before them the things we have heard detrimental to their character and influence, pray with and for them? Now this, I've learned too by experience that even though you won't listen, or you listen and you plan to go and talk to the person about it, that is the one they were talking about, you plan to do that sometimes that's not good either. But I have learned that so few people will go to the person involved and talk to them about it, that sometimes I do listen. But my practice is, if somebody tells me something bad about somebody else, is that you can know that I'll be going to that person and telling them what I heard about them. And if what I got told was not true, I'm going to come back to you and tell you what I found out. So I found that practice has pretty well stopped a lot of the communication that would maybe normally come my way. But it's even better if we could all be faithful so that we could say to each other, I don't want to hear it, and then maybe even say, have you talked to the person involved to make sure the story is true? And if we'd all do that and people would go and talk, then that would clear everything up. We'd never have to really worry about it. Now here's the sobering thought. 5th Testimonies 176 and 7. Evil speaking is a twofold curse, falling more heavily upon the speaker than upon the hearer. Now, I'm sure you've all had your reputation hurt to some degree by what somebody said, and it's always very painful when that happens. But when it does, just remember, no matter how much it hurts you, it hurt the one that spread the story worse. And therefore, they're damaging themselves by this practice. And we need to feel sorry for them. Rather than thinking about our reputation, we need to be feeling sorry for them because they've hurt themselves more. He who scatters the seeds of dissension and strife reaps in his own soul the deadly fruits. So it's like planting seeds. If we yield to the temptation to share negative things about each other, that develops a character in us in which a very unfortunate character comes out of that. And one of the things I believe it does is it trains us to look for the bad. Whenever I come across this topic, I think of one pastor that was at Wildwood when I first came. And I kind of thought he was a little blind because he couldn't see anything wrong with anybody. You never heard him say one negative thing about anybody. But later, after a while, I began to realize, well, he must have had a real victory in this area, and he just wouldn't look at those things or talk about those things. How miserable is the talebearer, the surmiser of evil. He is a stranger to true happiness. Why? Because he's always busy finding dirt. He's always busy finding things that are bad and unfortunate. The sin of evil speaking begins with the cherishing of evil thoughts. So that's where we should fight the battle. When negative thoughts come in our mind about somebody, that's where to gain the victory, before we talk, before we say anything. Guile includes impurity in all its forms. An impure thought tolerated, an unholy desire cherished, and the soul is contaminated, its integrity compromised. If we would not commit sin, we must shun its very beginnings. Every emotion and desire must be held in subjection to reason and conscience. So if thoughts come in our mind, a negative about somebody, and we're all different, and we all irritate each other to some degree. And that's why the thoughts can get started in there. But we must recognize that we possibly are irritating them as well. And therefore, we need to not think about that, not dwell upon that. If it's something serious enough, we may need to talk to the person, but not to, keep thinking about this person and how terrible they are because they're like this. If we would not commit sin, we must shun its very beginnings. Every unholy thought must be instantly repelled. How are we going to do that? To your closet, followers of Christ. So I've tried to learn to do that. When those kind of thoughts come in my mind, I say, Lord, please help me not to be dwelling upon this. Now, some of them are true, of course, but we don't need to be thinking about it. 7th Testimonies 2:60. Men have no right to surmise evil in regard to their fellow men. Church members have no right to follow their own impulses and inclinations in dealing with fellow members who have erred. So here's a case where, sin was committed, and even then, though, we are not to be spreading around what they have done, but God has a plan to deal with it. They should not even express their prejudices regarding the erring, for thus they place in other minds the leaven of evil. Now, if a church doesn't do this, by the time we get to the business meeting, the person is already condemned. They're not going to be able to have a fair hearing because so much talk has gone on about what they did. This is unfortunate. Reports unfavorable to a brother or sister in a church are communicated from one to another of the church members. Mistakes are made and injustice is done because of an unwillingness on the part of someone to follow the directions given by the Lord Jesus. And here's what Jesus told us. If thy brother shall trespass against thee, Christ declared, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. Do not tell others of the wrong. Do not tell others of the wrong. One person is told, then another, and still another, and continually the report grows and the evil increases till the whole church is made to suffer. You know, as we think about having a church where everybody feels safe, their reputation is not tarnished by anybody. Isn't that worth? Wouldn't you like to be in a church like that? Wow. It would be the safest place on earth to have a church where you know that everybody in there, although you may irritate them, that everybody in there is going to be dwelling on your good points, and they're not going to be spreading around what they think you did bad, or your bad characteristics are not going to be spreading those either. I think this church would be packed in a little while if the word gets out that it's like that in New England. Settle the matter between thee and him alone. This is God's plan. Go not forth hastily to strive. In other words, don't get stirred up against somebody quickly. You may not know the whole story. Go not forth hastily to strive, lest thou know not what to do in the end thereof, when thy neighbor hath put thee to shame. So when the truth comes out, then you feel embarrassed. Oh, why did I say anything? Why did I do anything? Because it's not even true. Debate thy cause with thy neighbor himself, and discover not a secret to another. So even in the Old Testament, this was so important that God gave this through Solomon, the Matthew 18 principle, and then Jesus expanded on it when he came. Do not suffer sin upon your brother. So in other words, we're not just to ignore when a member does wrong. We are to labor with them. We are to pray for them, but not to spread it around to others. Do not suffer sin upon your brother, but do not expose him, and thus increase the difficulty. Well, I'm sure as you've listened to this that you want to be like that. And so what stands in the way is the bad habits we may have allowed in the past and the work of the devil, but Jesus stands ready to help us to have the total victory in this area so that we can have a church where anyone that comes here knows that their reputation is safe. None of us have all bad habits. That's a good thing. None of us have all irritating habits. And so the success in marriage is dwelling on the good habits of the individual rather than the bad. And the same is true of a church. May God bless us to that end.